Hi, Brent.
Hi.
This is Sarah Posner, and this is the Posner Show. And my guest today is Brent Sasley of the University of Texas at Arlington. And we are going to talk about a lot of issues that have been in the news lately with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and in particular, Israel's now over Operation Protective Edge in Gaza. So, Brent, tell me this. Is liberal Zionism dead?
So it's an interesting question, and lots of people, or I should say, lots of men have been asking that particular question, and lots of people have answered the question with a yes or a qualified yes, or a sense that it is dying. At a minimum, many of them say that it's at a crossroads.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the question is predicated on an assumption that isn't necessarily true.
Okay.
So liberal Zionism it's a recent creation, and it's not used all that much in Israel. I mean, for most Israelis, there's Zionism, and it's the way that politics gets played out in the country that determines which strain of Zionism becomes predominant and forms governmental decisions. And typically that's left, right, religious, or some broad category like that. Liberal Zionism gets used a lot more in the diaspora, and especially in the United States.
Right.
United States Jewish community and the United States as a whole. So that's the first point. The second point is that it's a recent phenomenon. The notion that...
relative to Zionism as a whole?
Yes. Okay. The onset of Zionism in the 1890s, or if you want to talk about proto-Zionism, even before that. And in terms of Israel itself, 1948.
Mm-hmm.
So Israel has never really been a liberal place in the sort of classic Western, individual rights-oriented community. So for most of Israel's existence, it was dominated by Mapai, the forerunner of labor, which emphasized socialism and collectivism.
Mm-hmm.
And individual rights were something to be maybe not dismissed, but were frowned upon because they undermined the ability of this state that needed a cohesiveness. It needed its population to sacrifice their individual needs and rights for the good of the state, which was facing this precarious or a constant situation of threat. And so individual rights were really, they were not there from the beginning. And it really wasn't until the 1980s, 1990s that individual rights became something that was viable and something that was talked about and something that was set as a goal, or at least in a broad sense. There were always some individuals who talked about it that way. And of course, the other thing to remember is that the people who did talk about rights as in the individual sense were the revisionist Zionists, the predecessors of today's Likud.
Right.
And so the assumption today, and it's a fair one, I think it's accurate, is that the Likud of today has a very tribal understanding of rights. In other words, groups. And for them, for most of the Likud, not every single member, but for most of Likud, group rights should be oriented toward Jewish rights because Israel is a Jewish state, and therefore those rights need to be privileged over others' rights.
Right.
So I think when people talk about liberal Zionism, they miss the fact that there's been this long road that from the beginning was not fundamentally oriented toward individual rights that these liberal Zionists emphasize today. And so when you ask the question whether or not liberal Zionism is dead or at a crossroads or dying, it misses the point that it's actually pretty new. And I don't think it's fair to say that it's at a crossroads or dying right just after the moment of its creation or its emergence.
Well, is it fair to say that liberal Zionism is an invention of the West? The invention of Enlightenment-inspired cultures like Western Europe and the United States, where you have what has been characterized by several people, including, notably Peter Beinart, in his book Crisis of Zionism, where there's a conflict between how you conceive of individual rights and liberty with the way Zionism has played out in Israel, particularly in the last, let's say 20 years.
Sure.
And so in a way, maybe it's a contradiction to even talk about it in that sense, because you're putting on a conception of rights and liberty that you're saying Israel never really recognized or Zionism really never recognized in the first place.
I don't know who first used the term, and I can't specifically say when it became popularized, but certainly it is tied to these long-standing Enlightenment or Western European notions of individual rights that societies can advance when individuals have these freedoms to be able to think about how to better organize themselves, to progress as individuals, and therefore society as a whole can progress.
Right.
And yes, that is at odds with the nature of Zionism as it was first founded. Although not with Zionism has always been composed of a number of different streams or strains. And so the revisionist Zionists under Jabotinsky, after he died, that version of revisionist Zionism sort of fell away with him. But they were a little bit more oriented toward the individual notion. But even they emphasized collectivism, collective responsibility, self-sacrifice, the good of the community, the nation, the people, the Jewish people. So the idea of liberal rights as individual rights is a little bit at odds with that. And that's understandable because Zionism was heavily influenced by Eastern European nationalism, which again was very collectivist in nature.
So we don't know who started using the term liberal Zionist?
I know that Peter Beinar, for example, has certainly popularized it. I can't say for sure who used it first. Right.
Well, it's interesting because in some, left-wing anti-Zionist circles, liberal Zionist is a derogatory term. It's it's used with derision to describe people who are generally liberal but are supportive of Israel, and it's used derisively to describe somebody who basically shuts down their liberalism when it comes to Israel. And it's particularly used as a derogatory term to describe somebody who continues to think that Israel, as it is constituted today, could be something that aligns with their liberal values.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's fair.
I don't either. But I'm just saying that it's used. Yeah. It's used that way. You see it used that way.
Well, any ism is a creation. It's a human creation, and we use it as shorthand, right? It's a convenient term. So, liberal Zionism is a convenient term to refer to people. And again, I think it primarily refers to people outside of Israel, even though people in Israel might subscribe to its views, don't really use the term. But people who support two states, a Jewish majority state and a Palestinian state, people who support a number of individual rights in Israel itself, say, for example, personal status, marriage, divorce, burial, and people who also support more communal rights for the Arab minority in Israel. In other words, a recognition that Jewish identity is important for Israel, but it's not mutually exclusive with individual rights and communal rights for different groups in Israeli society.
So Anthony Lerman's piece in the Times this weekend drew a lot of attention because he was essentially saying, look, can these things be compatible with one another? And you're saying, yes, of course.
Yes, I think they can.
But don't you think that for, let's call them liberal Zionists, or even maybe not liberal Zionists. I think that there are a lot of American Jews who are liberals who might not self-identify as a Zionist. Like that term might be too strong to describe how they feel about Israel. That they may describe themselves as, pro-Israel. Like they think that Israel should exist and they think that Israel should be a democracy and they think there should be a two-state solution and, all of that whole package of things that kind of what you described before. But, they don't really, it's not like they're rah-rah Israel no matter what. But so do you think that for people like that, which, I think that they may not be very politically active, and so it's political advocacy organizations may not be dependent necessarily day to day on their support, but are people in that position being forced to confront?
Sorry.
Yeah, like Operation Protective Edge and the events immediately leading up to it. The murder of Mohammed Abu Qatar and the police brutality against his cousin, and the occupation in general, and then what happened in Operation Protective Edge, where there was a massive amount of destruction and civilian casualties. I mean, do you think that for people like that, for American Jews like that was this a turning point? Was this something that is going to make them reevaluate, not necessarily their Zionism, but their mild support for Israel?
Yeah.
Or their reflexive support for Israel, I guess, would be a better word.
Right. I think 3 points sort of jump out at me from that particular question. First, and this might get to the piece that you recently wrote on the collapse of the center of the U.S. Jewish community, or the U.S. Jewish Zionist pro-Israel community. First, you're right. There are a lot of Jews who don't think as themselves as Zionists, but who generally think that Israel has the right to exist as a Jewish majority state, or a state with a firm Jewish identity. For them, I think for them, or for many of them, especially in the younger generation, but not only, I think for many of them, there is a sense that, okay, I believe that Israel is Jewish and should be Jewish, but, I'm also very liberal in the individual rights sense. And I'm not quite sure how I need to reconcile those things. Second point, I think, is that, so two points that jump out at me from this. And the second main point, back to 3 points. Second point is...
you can have as many points as you want.
There are so many points, so many things to say. The second point is something that, of course, Peter Beinart has been talking about for a number of years, which is that things that are happening in Israel are raising questions about the dichotomy or the balance or the ability of the Zionist identity and the liberal identity to be compatible. I think it's a mistake to say that this Gaza operation, the one that just ended, is a turning point. And Anthony Lerman does this in his piece, and a couple other people have mentioned it as well. Jonathan Chait, Ezra Klein. They talk as something that it might raise questions for them. And to me, that's a little bit naive, and that's completely detached from the Israeli experience, and it demonstrates that people hold assumptions without knowing the specific history of Israel. I mean, Israel has been engaged in bloody wars and skirmishes for decades, right? Ever since 1948. There's nothing that is particularly more bloody about this conflict than there is about any of the others.
Well, okay, but there were far more civilian casualties in Operation Protective Edge than in Operation Cast Lead and Operation Pillar of Defense combined.
Right.
That was one thing. So in recent memory...
That's sure, but the numbers themselves are only part of the story.
Well,
and I think people who rely on the numbers, and the reason why I think is because I think, and I've made this argument before, I think that Hamas did a lot to make Israel's case for it. You could argue that Israel didn't really want to accept ceasefires. You could argue that it was just trying to play the game. But the optics are that Israel accepted previous efforts at ceasefires and Hamas didn't. Hamas has also used these tunnels. It also fired rockets at civilian populations. Hamas didn't give any indication that it was trying to avoid civilian casualties. And whether or not you agree Israel did enough, whether or not you agree it was serious efforts, Israel could say, oh, well, at least we tried. Knock on roofs, we dropped pamphlets. I think that those factors mitigate the numbers for people. And I think that Israel has had a lot more sympathy in this round of violence, despite these higher numbers of Palestinian civilian casualties, than it has in previous conflicts. Well, now, I think that changed toward the end, when UN facilities were being hit. But I think that's a basic factor that I think focusing on numbers or focusing on this particular campaign do miss. Well, and any disillusionment with Israel, I think for most people who thought about these issues began before this conflict, before this campaign.
Okay, well, I have a couple points that come to my mind based on what you say, and one is that I think that by you saying that it wasn't worse than previous conflicts, and
it wasn't okay. Yeah.
Okay, all right. And Israel made efforts with the knocks and the warning bombs. I think that this was a conflict that was very much defined for people by their social media circles or by their media circles, like what they were reading and seeing about the conflict. And I think that for a lot of people, the knocks and the warning bombs were not okay. Like that was not okay. Yeah. That does not absolve Israel of moral responsibility for the deaths of civilians, because I mean, they had nowhere to go. I mean, Jon Stewart popularized this idea that, those warnings were inadequate because Gazans had no place to escape to where they could have been safe. So, but I think that also, back to the social media thing, I mean, I think that you could have surrounded yourself or immersed yourself in media and social media that portrayed that point of view, that like these were adequate steps taken by the Israeli military to protect civilians. But on the flip side, you could have not had that. And that happens to be, I mean, that these steps were inadequate happens to be the position I have, I think, regardless of what my social media world was saying about it. I mean, that was just an evaluation I came to on my own. But I think that also the social media was so explicit and informative to people about what was going on there, particularly because I'm not talking about social media that was political rhetoric or political diatribe. I'm talking about social media as used by reporters on the ground in Gaza. And so I think that actually seeing all of that firsthand by reporters who work for media organizations that are considered, reliable and, actually fair and balanced, and, not political shills for anybody on one side or the other. I think that drove a lot of people's point of view. Now, you are immersed in this sort of thing every day. Israelis are obviously immersed in this sort of thing every day, but somebody like, Ezra Klein or Jonathan Chait or somebody like that, they write about a whole host of other issues in their lives as journalists, and they're not following this on the level of detail that other people are. And that is more in line with how most American Jews receive their information about the conflict as well. They probably read less about it than somebody like Ezra Klein or Jonathan Chait does. So when you're in that vacuum, maybe you're right, but it depends on the person. But I think that if you're in the sort of vacuum where you're not keeping up with the conflict on a date, and the overall conflict, not this particular conflict, Operation Protective Edge, on a day-to-day basis, then this is going to come out at you in a way that seems very extreme. And it should, because, I think it should. I think that what you're saying is like, well, this is part of like an ongoing conflict, and that's true to a certain extent, but I don't think that mitigates people's feelings of horror at seeing dead children and their grieving families.
Okay, so no, it does. Okay, so first, social media, it's a place where you have echo chambers. Mm-hmm. There are studies that show that if you're more likely to be left and you want to get your news from Haaretz, that's where you got your news from. So especially on social media like Twitter and Facebook and certain blogs, these are really just echo chambers. And many of the people, I would even say most of the people who follow those Twitter accounts or post on those Facebook threads were already predisposed or already share the same views. They're not going to be convinced one way or the other. I do agree with you that when news media, like the New York Times or other places like that, did use social media to put things out there, that probably did have more of an effect. But
and I think that wasn't just photos, because obviously there were reporters posting photos, but there were also reporters, many of whom I follow on Twitter, who were posting minute by minute. I heard and that this is true also of reporters who were in Israel and tweeting about air raid sirens and rockets falling in Israel. So it gives you this kind of sense of urgency of how like this. It's almost like you're there, or you're hearing a blow by blow, play by play of what's happening. And I think that brings it to you in a way that maybe just watching the network news for 20 minutes in the evening after you get home from work doesn't.
Yes. Okay. So two underlying points. First, the people who might be convinced, people who don't operate in an echo chamber and might read what a New York Times reporter tweeted out, mm-hmm. that there was just an airstrike and so on, that probably did change some minds. But two sort of, in a sense, they're contradictory, but I guess they're really not. And I talked about this in my political piece, that most of world opinion was before the Gaza war was already predisposed to be more sympathetic to, called the other side, mm-hmm. or the Palestinian cause and so on. Mm-hmm. Did this reinforce in their minds their previous or their prior views? Probably.
Mm-hmm.
World opinion has long been against Israel. That's not a function of this conflict. It's a function of the occupation and the ongoing settlement enterprise, which is why I think that focusing on this particular conflict is inaccurate, or at a minimum, it's incomplete. But second, again, we know public opinion polls tell us that Americans are still overwhelmingly more sympathetic to Israel than the Palestinians.
But that's changing a little bit. It's not as monolithic as it once was.
Yes, it's changing a little bit. But I mean, if you think of polls as trends and you think of them as large numbers, the numbers are still pretty solid. Where they are changing are among the difference between Democrats and Republicans. But I'm not so sure. That's probably a function of changes among the Democratic Party itself. But we're still talking about very large numbers. Very large majorities of Americans are still more, if you want to use the term pro-Israel, than pro-Palestinian. Those terms are very vague, but for our purposes. That isn't changing all that much. And the changes that are taking place, again, are a function of other things, not this particular war. I don't think that we're going to see a major drop in support for Israel in these public opinion polls because of this war. Right? During the war, you see changes. That's because when pictures of dead children and rubble are being tweeted out at the time, that's going to have an immediate effect.
Wait. So, but didn't I read this morning that Netanyahu's public opinion of Netanyahu in Israel was at an all-time high during Operation Protective Edge, but now that it's over, it's plummeting.
Well, I'm talking about American public opinion.
Okay. All right.
That's a separate issue.
Well, I guess we can get to that maybe if we have time.
But the other thing that I was going to say was that governments were a lot more sympathetic to Israel this time than in the last two rounds, especially in Europe. That's where you saw a key difference. And that's what was the most important point underlying my original comment, that this war itself is a little bit different.
Right. Well,
that's why, and that's the Obama administration and European governments as well. And that's demonstrated in their rhetoric and in the solutions that they were proposing for the end of the conflict.
Right, but all of those governments are still, notwithstanding this immediate conflict, are still opposed to the occupation and the ongoing settlement enterprise.
Because those are the main issues for them, not this particular war.
Right. So let's talk about some phenomena that happened in the United States during Operation Protective Edge, namely the uptick that was reported by left-leaning Jewish organizations that were opposed to Operation Protective Edge. So these were organizations and, I guess, groups of people who were not just opposed to the occupation and not just opposed to settlements, but actually took a position against Operation Protective Edge. So I wrote this story a few weeks ago about this and about the dissatisfaction of a lot of people. Well, just to explain the spectrum here. So if you say that sort of J Street is kind of in the middle here, so like you have AIPAC and Zionist Organization of America over here on the right, and then
I wouldn't put them together though.
Right, I'm saying Zionist Organization of America is to the right of them. Okay, and then in the center kind of is J Street, pro-peace, pro-two-state solution, and then on the left you have an organization like Jewish Voice for Peace, and based on my reporting during this conflict, what you had happened was J Street was a little bit paralyzed in coming to a decision on what position to take on Operation Protective Edge, and ultimately came out with a statement supporting the operation, even though obviously J Street has a position against the occupation and continued settlement building. And there were quite a number of people who, and this is within J Street's orbit, not people who are unaffiliated with J Street, who were extremely dissatisfied, and dissatisfied, I think, is a mild term for how they reacted to J Street's decision not to oppose Operation Protective Edge. And you saw the rise of this new group called If Not Now, based on Hillel's words, if not now, when? And they were doing some things that in tactics were similar to Jewish Voice for Peace. They staged a protest outside the offices of the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, and they had a letter from Malcolm Heinlein, the president of that organization. And there was one action where some people got arrested for civil disobedience. But it doesn't take this same stance. It doesn't take this kind of hardline anti-Zionist, anti-Israel stance that Jewish Voice for Peace often does. It really, these people involved with If Not Now are really speaking, to me at least, my perception of it was they were really speaking more from a position of people who had been very involved in synagogue life and youth group life as teenagers and young adults. And so they were really coming really from a position of knowing Jewish communal life really well and still having a pro-Israel orientation. And, it's hard to measure these sorts of things. Jewish Voice for Peace claimed to me that they had, during the conflict, seen 50,000 more people sign up for their email alerts. And that doesn't tell you a lot. I mean, it doesn't tell you the level of commitment of those, or if there's even a commitment at all. It may just be a curiosity. So it's not really a sign of membership or donations or anything like that. And If Not Now is more in the style of the Occupy movement, where there's no organizational structure to speak of, and they just, come together and things seem to be organized via social media and that sort of thing. So it's hard to measure. So how much of an effect are these sorts of groups actually going to have on American Jewish organizations' position? I mean, is there any leverage that they actually have apart from being a protest movement or a movement of dissent?
The first thing I would say is that you have to applaud what J Street tried to do, which is form a center-left organization that could operate not just at the grassroots level, but in politics, and pose a serious alternative to AIPAC. Mm-hmm. But doing that very thing, it was built around a set of contradictions that could not be contained. And we've seen that now. We've seen that in the case of when the political debates in Washington over strikes, over the Iran deal, over strikes on Syria, and now, as you said, over Operation Protective Edge. These contradictions can't be contained. And that is that J Street has a large grassroots organization that is tied to all these younger generation, people who were involved in their synagogues, national student groups, alternate religious institutions for prayer and so on. And they are dissatisfied with the old style, slower process of politicking in Washington. And so they have sort of taken matters into their own hands and therefore sort of bucked the national leadership's decisions. And that's where this comes from. Mm-hmm. That's where this comes from. Do I think that they have the chance to shift things? I think they can, and they have shifted the debate. They do a lot to raise these issues and put them on the agenda for discussion. Can they actually shift the politics? Not in the short term. And that's because the Jewish community, and it's not just the Jewish community, but it's also Washington, but the national Jewish organizations, politics operates in a certain way. And these longer established organizations have a number of connections in Washington, and they are widely recognized and taken as representative of the Jewish community. And there's not that much space to suddenly, crop up and do something, or at least take charge of these things. That's a longer term process. And right. You get the shifting the debate at the lower levels.
Right. Well, it was interesting. For the piece that I did, I interviewed Rick Jacobs, who's a rabbi and is the president of the Union for Reform Judaism, which is the largest Jewish denomination in North America. Yeah. And, he said, in the reform movement, he said that there wasn't any movement away by young people. And I think he was really referring to people who had basically made the long-term commitment of being involved in the denomination's youth groups and young adult groups, and we're going to Israel for the summer and that sort of thing. So I think that that's kind of like a self-selected group that's going to, they've already made this decision that they're kind of all in. But I just wonder, whether in the reform movement, and I belong to a reform synagogue, so I'm speaking from a position of observing things outside of my life as a reporter, I wonder, if there's a falling away before they even get to that point, before they get really involved in, they may have their bar bat mitzvah, but then after that, they're not as intimately involved with denominational life and its organizations. And so what is that? And, I guess I don't have numbers and I don't have, but I just wonder if there's going to be an impact of, gradually an impact of these groups like J Street U, and if not now, J Street U being the organization's university campus arm, which is definitely to the left of J Street itself. And what kind of impact that's going to have over the next couple of generations of young Jews.
So there are two ways to change things in the organized Jewish community. One is to change the array of political forces by changing public opinion, putting items on the agenda, opening up the discussion. And the second way is by going through existing organizations, or if you're lucky, creating something like J Street that pretty quickly becomes an accepted organization. Mm-hmm. It's too early to say which. I think the best chance to have an effect is by the first method, changing the broader political forces by raising new issues, putting new items for discussion on the agenda. It's harder to work through existing organizations or even new ones, and J Street obviously demonstrates that. I mean, for two reasons. First, mostly because we need more time to know what the effects will be. So there are people who have done studies, generational studies, and suggest or argue that the older Jews become, the more they shift away from these, call them more radical policies or more grassroots efforts, and they become a little bit more established. That's a generational thing that just happens over generations. And if that's the case, then this current movement is going to go through the same thing. I don't think it will. I think that things that have developed over the last 10 years or so, I think that has changed things. And I think you do have a new group of younger Jews who are committed to changing things. And I don't think that they'll go back to that. I think that generational cycle has probably been disrupted a little bit. But we need more time to see whether or not that actually plays out. It's way too early to say.
How would social scientists go about studying that? I mean, can you get a cohort large enough for a survey to be able to draw any conclusions from it?
I mean, the best way would be to track people as they go through the main cycles of life. Mm-hmm. But you could probably, public opinion surveys that continuously ask about, put people in age groups, income levels, education levels, geography, where they live. And you can, one way would be to track that over time, so that if you ask the survey every 5 years, every 10 years, you can start to identify these generational shifts. Donations.
Right.
Or Sasan has been very creative at tracking Jewish donations, where they go for Jewish causes or Israel causes or causes in Israel. That also tells you, or that also can tell you something. So I think that those are a couple ways that you can do it. It takes creativity and energy.
Right.
But it's possible.
And on the donation issue, one of the things that I wondered about as I was reporting that story was if there is still a cohort, even of younger Jews, who are committed to donating to and supporting, the Conference of Presidents or the, organizations that comprise the American Jewish establishment. So this generation of Jews that are getting involved in J Street U, and if not now, if their peers, if there's a cohort of their peers that is still committed, like we hear a lot about the younger Jews who are turning away from the Jewish establishment, but isn't there still a cohort of younger Jews who are committed to the Jewish establishment? And as long as there's some cohort of them, why should the Jewish establishment care about the upstarts?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So, in my research, when I do interviews with people at national Jewish organizations or prominent regional ones, a lot of the people I interview are younger, mm-hmm. right? And so I think you're exactly right that there are, the focus is often on the cohort that is more left than J Street. But, in terms of numbers, it's not a large segment of the Jewish population in the United States. And there is, I don't want to use the term opposing, but there is a cohort that call them more pro-establishment or less radical, mm-hmm. Which, of course, is another factor that undermines the ability of the more radical cohort to get things done. But even when I talk to these younger people involved in the establishment or the established organizations, they share a lot of the same views and a lot of the same concerns. They're just going about it differently. Right, they're working with
a lot of the same views on the occupation.
especially the occupation,
Really?
but also concerned over trends in Israel. Not everybody, but many of them are. But
Uh-huh.
they're doing it in a different way.
So how are they going about it? Trying to make change from within?
Making changes from within, putting more items on the agenda.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't see as many knee-jerk defenses of Israel as you used to, I think, in statements put out at the national level. You also see some more criticism of Israel than you used to see 20 years ago. Those are new things, I think, or different things.
I mean, have you measured that you see? You don't see as many knee-jerk defenses of Israel?
No, I don't. I can't. This is more anecdotal.
Yeah.
I haven't compiled the numbers yet, but that's my sense.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, because that's, I guess, I mean, I'm willing to be convinced, but it doesn't seem obvious to me.
Well, I'm not saying there aren't any, and I'm not saying that groups don't do it, but and certainly there are still financial campaigns, fundraising campaigns every time there's a crisis. My sense is that it's not the same, but I can't quantify it at this point, and I don't think that it's this sudden massive shift. I'm talking still small.
Right.
But,
right. I mean, because remember, the Conference of Presidents just very recently voted down J Street's bid to become part of the Conference of Presidents. So, which is, when you
but there are a number of other but that
has to do with the strange voting system that they have and all of that. But
and it has to do with the way that J Street operated. Again, these existing organizations, they operate a lot more civilly friendly, right? They're more friendly to other established organizations. When J Street was created, it was not as friendly, right? And that was apparently a big part of what a lot of people in the conference thought, or at least
really
conditioned some of their that the notion that J Street doesn't play nice, and if we bring them in, then that might cause real problems for us as well. And that's not the way that we do business.
In what way did they think that J Street didn't play nice?
Well, that J Street just directly took on, let's say, AIPAC, directly disagreed with them, directly criticized these other AIPAC and these other organizations for not being critical enough of Israel.
Isn't that a great Jewish tradition, dissent?
Well, yes, but politics is something different.
Yeah. So, well, do you have any other thoughts about all of this and what we've been talking about and the whole,
Well, I mean, to bring it back to your piece, the collapse of the center. I don't think we're near any kind of collapse, and I don't think we're near any kind of major shift. I think that the ground has started to. I'll get away from that metaphor. I think that there have been some small changes, and I think that the cohort that we were discussing before, the one that wants to implement, very different ideas and policies, I think that they have been successful in putting things on the agenda. And you do get prominent commentators like Peter Beinart and others saying things in prominent American magazines and media that you didn't necessarily have before. These are important shifts. They change the parameters of the discussion. It won't be for some time before we see a major shift in Jewish national politics and Jewish national policy. That will take time. And that's a more open question, I think. So we're seeing the beginnings of it, but whether or not it turns out to, or what trajectory that takes, I think it's hard to say for sure at this point.
So do you think that it's going to change the way Israel gets discussed in congregational life? I mean, one of the issues that I didn't really explore in that piece, but like I said, hoping to explore in another piece, is rabbinical reaction to what's going on in Israel, and to what extent congregants feel satisfied or dissatisfied with the way rabbis discuss these issues.
That's a good question. I mean, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs came out last year, I think, or earlier this year. It was earlier this year with a study that suggested that pulpit rabbis are uncomfortable discussing Israel, and they don't, and they're far less critical of Israel on the pulpit than they might be elsewhere. I think that, I mean, again, most synagogues, there's still, this gets back to your actual original question, there's still a very basic, and I don't want to use the term knee-jerk because I don't think that's appropriate, but there's still a very basic identification with Israel there. So a basic underlying Zionism. And I think that rabbis, as channelers of a discussion. I think that they haven't moved as far as, let's say, this younger cohort that we were discussing. But you do get more conversations.
But if they have that younger cohort in their congregations, and I guess there's questions about whether they do, there are questions about whether that younger cohort is, active in synagogue life or even engaging rabbis in a conversation about, I'd like to see you talk about this differently. So it's hard to gauge, and I don't know if anyone's studied this either. The impact of some of these, J Street U, it's been around longer, obviously, than if not now, on how rabbis interact with that generation.
I think it's certainly something that needs more investigation, but synagogues are as much they're established institutions in our community as well, just like AIPAC or other national organizations. These are established organizations as well. And again, if this younger generation isn't willing to be in the synagogue as well as these other organizations, then it's not going to change the minds of the presidents of these synagogues, the boards, and the members and the congregations, which is, again, part of the reason why I say that change will be a lot slower and harder if they're not moving through these organizations. And it's safe to say, well, I would guess, my sense is that the synagogues and the pulpit rabbis will be among the last to engage in a major shift in policy and ideas discussion. It's a lot harder. Congregations are naturally more divisive. They're also smaller and more contained, so disputes become bigger and less easily managed. So it's probably the case that we'll see they will be among the last to have any kind of shift, whether we're talking major shift or smaller shift.
Right.
But I mean, in my own experience and from talking to people, there are still places, synagogues, where even in Reform and others, where there are changes taking place and conversations are happening and questions are being raised. Maybe not as quickly, not as deeply as people would like, but in some places it is happening.
But don't you think there's a chicken egg thing there? Because maybe if it's not happening fast enough, then people who have affiliated themselves with this dissenting view, throw up their hands at some point and say, I'm
Absolutely.
just tired of this. I am, quitting the synagogue or, quitting this synagogue or, looking for a minyan instead or whatever decision they make.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, anecdotally, I have a friend who, her name was bandied about as a potential president of the local community center, but there was some pushback from what we would call right-wing establishment Jews who are unhappy with her criticisms of Israel, and there was so much pushback that it got to the point where she was wondering whether or not it's worth trying, right? Whether or not it's worth fighting. Not to mention even the fact that what if she doesn't get accepted because of that? It's the fight itself. Yeah, I think that happens. I think that does happen. And I think that raises serious questions about how to go about this.
Yeah, right. Well, listen, thanks a lot for doing this. It was fun.
You're welcome. It was fun.
Okay, take care.
See you later.